right, more half magic time. More half magic chapter 5. Let's find out what happened to Martha. Ooh, we left off with, "Oh, hum, I wish you weren't here," Martha said sleepily. "Oh man," was the first thought of Jane. "Another wish wasted. Now she'll be only half here, I suppose." Then, as the idea of this sank in, her blood froze. She didn't dare to look. Would just a severed head and shoulders meet her gaze, or would there be only a pair of gruesome legs running around down there? At last, she made herself lean over and see. The charm, the charm hadn't worked it out that way at all. Martha was half there, to be sure, but it was all of her that was half there. Her outline was clear, but her features and everything that came between were sort of foggy and transparent. It was as though it were the ghost of Martha that stared up at Jane. She stared up at Jane and saw her horrified expression. Then she stared down at herself. And then Martha, or the half of her that was still there, lost her head completely. Uttering a low wail, she struggled to her feet, scrambled out through the row of seats, and ran up the aisle. It is not often that one is watching a movie and suddenly a wailing, ghostly figure rises from the floor and scrambles past one. Most of the ladies Martha scrambled past merely fainted. The woman who had not grasped it all before now gave a shriek and grasped her husband. "Oh," cried Jane in a rage, catching up her handbag. "I wish I'd never even heard of that charm." And immediately, she had only half heard of it. It was like a story she had read somewhere and half forgotten. And so naturally, she didn't think of using the charm to bring Martha back to normal again. Instead, she ran up the aisle after her. Mark and Catherine ran after Jane. An usher, running down the aisle to see what the commotion was, ran into them. He saw the handbag, heard the woman screaming, and decided Jane had stolen the bag. This slowed the children up a little, though no one was seriously hurt. The scratch that the usher received was just a mere scratch. Meanwhile, the ghostly Martha had run on up the aisle. In the darkness of the theater, not many people noticed her, but in the brightly lit lobby, it was another story. The ticket taker squealed and threw her tickets in the air. The manager came running out of his office. He saw Martha and turned pale. "Oh, what next?" he cried, tearing his hair. "As if business weren't bad enough already. Now the theater is haunted." He aimed a blow at her with his cash box. "Get along with you, you pesky thing," he cried. "Why don't you go back where you came from?" The hapless Martha moaned and flitted on through the lobby and into the street. The appearance of her ghostly form upon the sidewalk caused quite a stir among the city's crowd of shoppers. "It's an advertising stunt," said a stout woman. "What they don't think of to sell these here moon pictures next." "It's a sign," said a thin woman. "It's the end of the world, and me in this old dress." "Tell it to go away," groaned a well-dressed gentleman, "and I'll give back every cent I stole." "It's an outrage," muttered an elderly person. "I shall complain to my congressman." "It's a little girl. She's only half there," said a child. But of course, nobody paid any attention to her. Some people who were afraid of ghosts started running to get away from the horrible sight. Martha started running in the opposite direction to get away from the people. Other people saw them running and began to run too without even knowing why. In no time at all, a panic began to spread, as it will when people start behaving in this way without thinking. "What's the matter?" said a man to another man who was running by him. "You look as if you'd seen a ghost." "I just did," cried the man. "Look!" And he pointed at the fleeing Martha. Don't be silly," "Don't be silly. There's no such thing," said the first man, who happened to be a learned professor. He glanced at the misty Martha. "Marsh gas," he said. "Very interesting." "Martians? Did you say Martians?" said a third man who happened to be passing by. "The Martians are invading us," he cried, without waiting for an answer. He began to run, and everyone who heard him began running too. By the time Jane and Mark and Catherine had dealt with the usher and emerged from the movie theater, pandemonium reigned in the street. Someone had called the fire department and turned in a general alarm. Someone else had telephoned the police and asked them to send the riot squad. The wails of approaching fire sirens and the screeches of police whistles added confusion to the scene. A crowd of people rushed past the theater. "The Martians have landed," they cried, pointing back in the opposite direction. "We saw one of them, all transparent and horrible." Jane and Mark and Catherine looked up the street in the direction the people were pointing in. Far in the distance, they could just make out the dim figure of Martha running along all by herself. They ran after her. By this time, no one was paying any attention to Martha at all. Everyone was too busy worrying about imaginary men from Mars. But somehow, once she had started running, Martha found that she couldn't stop, and the more she ran, the more frightened she felt. This often happens. She came to a corner and turned it. The noise of the shouting and the sirens died away behind her. She was in a quiet street she had never seen before, a street of little shops. The street was deserted. Martha chose the middle shop and went in. A few seconds later, Jane and Mark and Catherine came round the corner and stood looking at the little shops. There was no sign of any part of Martha. "Use the charm," Mark cried. "Wish." "Oh, that old story," said Jane. "Whoever believed that?" Mark and Catherine stared at her with open mouths. "What did you say?" said Mark. Jane didn't answer. Quickly making up her mind, she chose a shop at one end of the row and started in. Mark and Catherine, wondering what in the world had happened to Jane, followed. Then the three children stopped in the doorway, horrified. The shop was a jeweler's, and costly diamonds and rich rings glittered on its counters. In the shop were a man and a woman. The man had a cap pulled low over his eyes. The woman wore a black and white skirt and a red blouse. "Come on," the man was saying. "Now's the chance to loot the joint while everybody's away watching the riot." The man and woman started loading their pockets with pieces of jewelry from the counter. Catherine chose this moment to sneeze. The man and woman turned and saw the three children standing in the doorway. The man with the cap advanced toward Jane in a menacing fashion. "Okay," he said, "hand over the bag." Jane clutched her handbag to her. She seemed to half remember that there was a particular reason why she shouldn't lose it, but she couldn't think what that reason was. She didn't know what to do. But Mark knew. He put his hand on the bag Jane was holding and wished he and Jane and Catherine were where Martha was, only twice as far. The next moment, the man in the cap and the woman in the red blouse were alone, looking at the spot where the three children had been. "Jeepers creepers," said the man in the cap. "They flew the coop." When Martha ran into the middle shop, at first she didn't see anybody, only books. There were books in shelves on all the walls and books on tables in all the corners. There was a large desk in the middle of the shop piled high with books, and at first that seemed to be all. Then a face appeared at Martha from over the pile of books on the desk, and a second later a rather small gentleman emerged from behind it. The gentleman wore a small, pointed beard, and he held an open book in one hand. He looked at Martha. Martha looked back at him, waiting for him to scream or faint or run away the way everyone else had. But the rather small gentleman did none of these things. He smiled and bowed politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "I presume this is a ghostly visitation? I am honored. Did you come out of one of the books? You might be Little Nell, I suppose, or Amy March, though the clothes don't look right." "No, I'm Martha," said Martha, "and I didn't come out of a book. I came by magic charm." And although she was old enough by now to know that no grown-up will ever credit any story that has magic in it, she proceeded to tell the small gentleman all about her charm, starting from the beginning. The small gentleman seemed particularly interested in the part about the children's mother. "This didn't happen out on West Bancroft Street by any chance, did it?" he interrupted her to ask. "About 3 nights ago?" "Why, yes. How did you know?" said Martha, amazed. Never mind," said the small gentleman. "Do go on. Tell me more." So Martha told him all about the movies and Jane's putting her under the seat and the wish she had made and all that had happened afterwards. "And so here I am," she ended, I'm only half here." "So I see," said the small gentleman. It's kind of an interesting feeling. Now I'm not scared anymore, said Martha. Only I'm about ready for it to stop now. Mother will be expecting us by dinner time, and I'm afraid she might not like it if I came home like this. She isn't good with magic the way you are. It upsets her. Yes, I know it does, said the small gentleman absently. Oh, do you know Mother? Said Martha. Oh, well, not exactly, said the small gentleman. Are you catching those? Then how do you know about her? Are you magic too? Are you a wizard or something? I thought you might be when I saw that beard. Do you know any tricks to put me back together again? I'm afraid not, said the small gentleman. Of course, if Mark and Catherine and Jane were here, Martha went on, they've got the charm and they could wish me back. Don't you have any spells to sort of summon people? The small gentleman shook his head. No spells, and I'm not a wizard, I'm sorry to say. This is the first magic thing that ever happened to me, though I always hoped something would, but maybe we can find them by regular means. What did they do when you ran out of the theater? Did they run after you? Martha looked startled. Why, she said, I never even thought to look back. They probably did, said the small gentleman. They've probably been following you all the time. They're probably outside the shop right now looking for you. I'll go see, said Martha, starting for the door. We'll find out what happens if they find her. And what is up with this small gentleman? Did you kind of figure some of that out? So we'll have to wait till tomorrow to see what else happens to Martha. Stay tuned for part 3 tomorrow. See you, love you, bye.